Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most influential people that you might have never heard about. What you are about to hear is a true story, not a myth, not a legend dressed up as history, a true story about a real man who lived and breathed and thought and suffered and strategized his way through one of the most remarkable lives ever recorded. His name was Chanakya, and almost everything powerful men know about power he wrote down first. He was born poor. He was laughed out of a king's court. He had no army, no land, no money, and no name that anyone of importance recognized. And from that starting point, he built the largest empire the Indian subcontinent had ever seen, not with a sword, with his mind. This is a story about what happens when someone refuses to accept the limits that the world places on them. When someone takes humiliation and turns it into fuel, when someone thinks so clearly for so long about power and strategy and human nature that they become genuinely unstoppable. It is a story about ancient India, yes, but it is also a story about every era, because the lessons Chanakya left behind have never stopped being true. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely like what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now sit back and relax, because this story begins over 2,000 years ago, in a small village, with a very unusual child, and a very patient father who told his son that ideas were the most dangerous weapons in the world. He was right. This is the life of Chanakya. What you are about to hear is a true story, not a myth, not a legend dressed up as history, a true story about a real man who lived and breathed and thought and suffered and strategized his way through one of the most remarkable lives ever recorded. His name was Chanakya, and almost everything powerful men know about power he wrote down first. He was born poor. He was laughed out of a king's court. He had no army, no land, no money, and no name that anyone of importance recognized. And from that starting point, he built the largest empire the Indian subcontinent had ever seen, not with a sword, with his mind. This is a story about what happens when someone refuses to accept the limits that the world places on them. When someone takes humiliation and turns it into fuel, when someone thinks so clearly for so long about power and strategy and human nature that they become genuinely unstoppable. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a land of ancient forests and monsoon rains, a land where the smell of sandalwood drifts through temple courtyards, where rivers run wide in silver under the blaze of an Indian sun, where kings wage wars over harvests and honor, and where the fate of millions rests on the word of one man with a throne. Now imagine that none of those kings, none of those empires, none of those thrones would have existed in the form they did were it not for one small, strange, ferocious child born in a humble village thousands of years ago. This is his story. This is the story of Chanakya, scholar, strategist, kingmaker, the man who wrote the rules of power so ruthlessly and so brilliantly that even today leaders study his words to understand how the world really works. The man who was ugly by his own admission, dismissed by those who looked at him, and yet who looked back at the world with eyes that saw further than anyone around him. We begin, as all great stories do, at the very beginning. The land that would later be called India was not one kingdom in those days. It was hundreds of kingdoms, hundreds of rivers, hundreds of languages, hundreds of kings with crowns carved from different stones and swords forged from different fires. It was around the 4th century before the Common Era, a time historians call the late Vedic period, a time of enormous intellectual energy but also of enormous fragmentation, of war and conquest and shifting borders. Into this world, in the region of Taxila, which we now place somewhere in what is modern-day Pakistan, near the ancient city of Takshashila, a child was born. His name at birth was Vishnugupta. His family name was Kautilya, and the name by which the world would eventually come to know him was Chanakya, drawn from the village of his fathers, the village of Chanakya. His father was a poor Brahmin scholar named Chanak, The word Brahmin in those days meant a man of the priestly and intellectual class, a man whose life was devoted to knowledge, to scripture, to the sacred texts of the Vedas. Being a Brahmin was not about wealth, it was about learning, and Chanakya, whatever his material poverty, was a man of deep learning and deep principle. There is a story, and it is one of the most famous stories told about Chanakya even before he could speak, a story that sets the tone for everything that will follow. It is said that when Vishnugupta was still a tiny infant, barely able to sit up on his own, his mother looked into his little mouth one day and saw something that made her blood run cold and her heart fill with wonder at the same time. The infant had a full set of teeth already formed, not the soft, gummy beginnings of baby teeth, but a complete set. Now, in the ancient wisdom traditions of India, this was considered a sign of the highest and most alarming kind. According to the astrologers and scholars who were called to examine the child, a boy born with a full set of teeth was destined to become a great king, or perhaps something even rarer, a maker of kings, a man who would sit behind the throne and hold the true power in his hands. His father Chanakya was a wise man, and wisdom sometimes means understanding that greatness of that kind comes with a terrible price. The sign that marked his son for kingship, he feared, would also mark the boy as a target for every jealous king, every suspicious court, every enemy who might wish to snuff out the flame before it could burn too brightly. And so, with love in his heart and fear in his mind, Chanakya made a decision. He broke the teeth. Gently, carefully, he removed them, so that no man who looked upon the infant would see the omen written in his gums. But here is the thing about destiny. You can chip it, you can reshape it, you can hide it, but you cannot erase it. The astrologers had already spoken, the stars had already arranged themselves, and the boy, toothless now like any ordinary infant, continued to grow. Chanakya's childhood was not easy. His family had very little money. They lived simply, eating plain food, wearing simple cotton, their home a modest structure by any measure. But what they lacked in coin, they possessed in something far more valuable: books, knowledge, conversation about ideas. From the very earliest age, the boy called Vishnugupta showed a mind of extraordinary sharpness. He asked questions that made grown men pause. He listened to his father's teachings not with polite attention, but with a kind of hungry intensity, absorbing everything, storing it away, turning it over in his mind like a jeweler examining a stone from every angle. His father taught him the Vedas, the ancient Sanskrit scriptures, the hymns and philosophies that formed the bedrock of Indian civilization at the time. He taught him arithmetic and astronomy, logic and rhetoric. He told the boy stories, not just the pleasant stories of gods and heroes, but the harder stories, the political stories, the stories of kings who rose by wisdom and fell by foolishness, the stories of empires that crumbled because a single man at the top had made one catastrophic mistake. Young Chanakya listened to every one of those stories with a child's wide eyes and a philosopher's mind. He was not like the other boys of his village who played in the river and chased goats through the market. He was the boy who sat under the trees and argued with his father about whether a king's first duty was to justice or to survival. He was the boy who, at an age when others were learning to wrestle, was already learning to think about power. There was also, from early on, the matter of his appearance. Chanakya was not considered handsome by the standards of his time or any time. He was thin and angular, his features sharp and severe. Some accounts describe him as having a dark complexion and crooked teeth, though whether that is poetic truth or historical record we cannot say for certain. What we do know is that throughout his life, Chanakya carried the awareness that the world would underestimate him based on how he looked, and rather than letting this crush him, he used it. He transformed it into fuel. He learned to let people see only what he wanted them to see, because they were already looking past him, and that invisibility, that assumption of harmlessness, would become one of his greatest weapons. When Chanakya was still a young boy, his father died. This is a loss we should not rush past. Chanakya was not just the boy's father, he was his first teacher, his first model of what a learned man could be. He was the voice that had first whispered to the child that ideas were more powerful than swords. His death left the family in difficult circumstances, and it left Chanakya with a grief that he carried quietly, in the manner of people who feel things very deeply but do not wear that feeling on their face. His mother, left alone with little resources, did what she could. And Chanakya, now older, now sharper, now aware in the way that poverty makes you aware that the world is not a gentle place, continued to learn. He read everything he could find. He sought out teachers wherever they existed, and it was this relentless hunger for knowledge, combined with the absence of his father, that eventually pointed him toward the place that would shape him most profoundly of all, Taxila, the great university city of Takshashila. The first thing Chanakya did after leaving Pataliputra was think. This is worth pausing on, because it tells us something fundamental about who he was. Another man, wounded with that kind of humiliation, burning with that kind of anger, might have raged immediately, might have gone looking for swords or allies, or some immediate and probably futile act of revenge. Chanakya did not do this. He had spent his entire life learning to think clearly, and he was not going to abandon that discipline at the moment when it mattered most. He understood, with cold and perfect clarity, that the oath he had sworn was meaningless without the means to fulfill it. He had no army, he had no money, he had no political standing. All he had was his mind and the knowledge accumulated over years of study. And from that starting point, he had to build everything else. What he needed, first and above all else, was a king. Not just any king, a particular kind of king. Someone who had the potential for greatness but had not yet been corrupted by it. Someone who could be shaped, guided, taught. Someone with enough warrior in them to fight the battles that would need to be fought, and enough intelligence to follow the strategy of a man smarter than themselves. Someone, in short, who could be the sword while Chanakya was the mind behind it. He began to travel. He wandered across the towns and forests and river plains of northern India, watching, listening, observing. He did what scholars and ascetics did in those days. He moved from place to place, accepting hospitality where it was offered, eating simply, sleeping rough when he had to. And all the while he was searching. The story of how he found Chandragupta Maurya is one of the great stories of the ancient world. The details vary across sources, and we should remember that we are in the territory where history and legend have long ago decided to share a bed. But the essential story goes like this. Chanakya, traveling through a rural area, came upon a group of children playing, and one of those children caught his eye immediately. The child was perhaps 10 or 11 years old. He was physically strong for his age, confident in his movements, with a bearing that was unusual in a boy of such obvious poverty, and the game he was playing was remarkable. He was not playing a child's game. He was playing at being a king. He had organized the other children around him, assigned roles, given orders, and was presiding over a mock court and a mock military exercise with a seriousness and a natural authority that made Chanakya stop in his tracks. The child's name was Chandragupta. In some accounts, Chandragupta was of royal blood, the illegitimate son of a Nanda prince, raised in obscurity by a cowherd family after his mother fled the court. In others, he was of more humble origin, a boy of the peacock tamer caste, whose extraordinary qualities had simply pushed through the constraints of his birth. The truth, as with much ancient history, is probably somewhere between the stories. What is consistent across all the accounts is this. Chanakya looked at that boy playing in the dust and saw, with the eyes of a man who had spent his life studying power, the makings of a king. He approached the family. He spoke with the people who were caring for the child. He used his considerable persuasive gifts, and perhaps whatever resources he had accumulated in his travels, to take Chandragupta under his care, to become, in effect, his teacher and his guardian. And then the real work began. If Chanakya's own education at Takshashila was rigorous, it was nothing compared to what he now imposed upon Chandragupta. He took the boy back to Taxila, to the intellectual world that had shaped Chanakya himself. And there, over years that were intense and demanding in a way that would seem almost cruel to modern eyes, he made Chandragupta into the leader he needed him to be. The curriculum was comprehensive in the deepest possible sense. In the mornings, before the sun rose properly over the horizon, Chandragupta trained physically. He ran, he wrestled, he practiced with weapons, with the sword and the bow and the spear and the shield. He learned to ride horses and to fight on horseback, to direct men in close combat, to hold his nerve in the chaos of a battle. He was not allowed to be soft. Physical toughness was not optional for what lay ahead. After the physical training came the intellectual training, and here Chanakya was perhaps even more demanding. He taught Chandragupta statecraft, the management of kingdoms, how to organize a treasury, how to deploy an army, how to build an intelligence network so that you always knew what your enemies were doing before they did it themselves, how to manage ministers, because ministers, as Chanakya well understood, could be either a king's greatest asset or his greatest threat, depending on how they were handled. He taught Chandragupta diplomacy, the ancient Indian concept of the 4 strategies of diplomacy, which Chanakya called the 4 upayas. The first was sama, the strategy of conciliation and negotiation. You tried to solve problems with words before you reached for swords. The second was dana, the giving of gifts, the use of incentive and reward to bring potential allies to your side. The third was beta, the strategy of division and discord, of finding the fractures within your enemy's alliance and exploiting them until the alliance fell apart. And the fourth was danda, force, the use of military power when all other options had been exhausted. A wise king, Chanakya taught, used all 4 in the right sequence and the right proportion. A king who went straight to force was a fool who burned through his resources and made enemies faster than he could defeat them. But a king who never used force was a weakling who would eventually be eaten alive by those who had no such restraint. He taught Chandragupta about espionage. This was perhaps one of the areas where Chandragupta was most original and most far ahead of his time. He had a sophisticated, almost modern understanding of the importance of intelligence, of knowing your enemy's plans before they were enacted, of having agents inside every court and every army and every city that mattered. He designed systems for recruiting spies, for running them without their knowledge of each other, for feeding false information to the enemy while extracting true information from them. He thought about spycraft the way a chess grandmaster thinks about chess. Many moves ahead, always with multiple contingencies, always building redundancy into the system, so that if one piece was lost, the whole network didn't unravel. He taught Chandragupta about economics, about taxation, about the relationship between a healthy agricultural economy and a strong state, about the management of trade and the regulation of markets. He taught him that a king who impoverished his people was not merely unjust but strategically stupid, because a poor and resentful population was a fragile foundation for any military or political ambition. And through all of this, Chanakya was not just teaching, he was also testing. He would set Chandragupta problems deliberately designed to be unfair. Situations where there was no clean answer, where every option had a serious cost, where the only way through was to think clearly without the luxury of thinking slowly. He wanted to see how the boy, and then the young man, handled pressure. He wanted to see whether the qualities he had identified in that dusty field, the natural authority, the strategic instinct, the physical courage, were real and deep, or merely the surface gifts of a clever child. They were real. Chandragupta proved himself repeatedly. He was not as intellectually subtle as his teacher, but he was something almost as rare. He was a man who could absorb a complex situation, extract the essential elements from it, and act decisively. He did not freeze. He did not second-guess himself into paralysis. He acted, and he acted well. By the time Chanakya judged that Chandragupta was ready, the student had become something remarkable. Not yet a king, not yet a conqueror, but the raw material for both. The moment had come to begin building the army that would change everything. The first attempt to take Magadha did not succeed. Chanakya later acknowledged this, and characteristically, he turned the failure into a lesson. He had made a strategic error, he admitted, in starting from the center, in aiming directly at Pataliputra, the Nanda capital, before he had secured the territories around it. It was like trying to kill a tree by attacking its trunk before you had dried up its roots. The first campaign was driven back. Chandragupta's forces, not yet large enough, not yet battle-hardened enough, could not sustain a campaign against the full weight of the Nanda military machine. Chanakya and Chandragupta retreated. They were, for a time, in genuine danger, hunted by Nanda agents, forced to move carefully and quietly through hostile territory. And there is a famous story from this period of retreat, a story that captures something essential about how Chanakya operated even in his darkest moments. The story goes that Chanakya and Chandragupta, hungry and exhausted, took shelter one night in a poor family's home. The woman of the house served them a simple meal of rice and vegetables. Chandragupta, ravenous, grabbed a handful of the hot rice from the center of the bowl, where it was densest and hottest, and burned himself. The woman watched this and said, quietly and without malice, that he was making the same mistake as that general who tried to attack Pataliputra from the center. You should eat from the edges first, she told him, where it is cooler. Let the heat at the center diminish before you reach for it. She said it about the rice. But Chanakya heard it as the military lesson he had failed to apply. You begin at the periphery. You secure the outlying territories, the border regions, the smaller kingdoms. You build your power from the outside in, tightening the ring around the center until the center has no choice but to fall. He never forgot this lesson. It changed everything about how the next campaign was planned. After the retreat, Chanakya set to work rebuilding, re-strategizing, and learning from every mistake of the first attempt. He was harder on himself than anyone else could have been. He believed with absolute conviction that failure was not a verdict. It was a teacher, and he was going to learn everything this particular teacher had to offer. The second campaign was different in almost every particular. Chanakya applied the lesson of the rice bowl with fierce discipline. Chandragupta's armies began in the northwest, in the territories that Alexander's successors were struggling to hold. These were taken one by one methodically, building a base of controlled territory from which the next campaign could be launched. Local rulers were given choices: join and be treated well, or resist and be crushed. Many chose to join. The promise of stability and just governance was compelling to populations that had endured years of instability. Each conquest funded the next. The treasury grew, the army grew, the reputation grew. Chanakya managed the intelligence operations with obsessive care. He had agents everywhere. He knew the movements of the Nanda armies before they knew them themselves. He knew which of Dhanananda's ministers were unhappy, which generals were underpaid, which provincial governors were resentful, and he worked each of those fractures with patient precision. He used the strategy of dividing the enemy not just militarily but politically. He encouraged defections from the Nanda side with promises of amnesty and reward. He spread stories through his agents, carefully crafted stories designed to make Dhanananda's court mistrust itself. Rumors that this general was secretly in contact with the enemy, doubts about that minister's loyalty, whispers that reached the king's ear and made him suspicious of the very men he needed most. A king who trusts no one, Chanakya knew, is a king who cannot effectively govern. A court riven with mutual suspicion is a court that cannot function, and a king who cannot trust his generals cannot effectively command his army. The Nanda military, which had been the most formidable in the region, began to fracture from within even before Chandragupta's armies reached Pataliputra. When the final campaign reached the Nanda capital, the city that had once seemed like an impregnable fortress was already hollowed out by betrayal and internal collapse. The battles were real and fierce. Men died in great numbers. There was nothing clean or bloodless about what happened. War, whatever its strategic elegance, is always brutal on the ground. But the outcome was, by that point, almost inevitable. Dhanananda, the king who had laughed at a poor scholar in his court years before and sent him away with nothing but humiliation, was deposed. The Nanda dynasty, which had ruled Magadha for generations, was ended. Chandragupta Maurya entered Pataliputra as its new ruler, and standing behind him, as he had always stood, watching the city his mind had built and rebuilt from nothing, was Chanakya. The word Arthashastra comes from two Sanskrit words, Artha, which means material well-being, prosperity, the practical necessities of human life, and Shastra, which means a treatise, a systematic body of knowledge. Together they name a work that can be translated, inadequately but usefully, as the science of material gain, or the science of governance and statecraft. It is one of the most remarkable books ever written, not because it is beautiful, though parts of it are written with a cold and precise elegance, not because it is comforting, because it is not. It is a book of hard truths, a book that looks at the world of power and politics without illusion, without sentiment, without the comfortable fictions that rulers usually prefer to believe about themselves. It is remarkable because it is comprehensive, because it is systematic, and because it is, in so many ways, as relevant to the world of power and governance today as it was when it was written 2,500 years ago. The Arthashastra covers an almost bewildering range of subjects. It begins with the king himself, with the education and character required of a ruler, with the disciplines of mind and body that a king must cultivate. Chanakya was deeply skeptical of kings who were lazy or self-indulgent, or who surrounded themselves only with flattery. A king's first duty, he wrote, was not to enjoy the pleasures of power but to master himself. The king who could not control his own passions and appetites could not possibly control a kingdom. He wrote about the king's daily schedule with extraordinary specificity. The king should rise before dawn. He should exercise and meditate and pray. He should meet with intelligence officers in the early morning hours, before the day's business began, to hear reports on anything that had occurred overnight. He should hold public audiences for petitioners, because a king who was inaccessible to his people was a king who was losing touch with the reality of his kingdom. He should meet with his ministers. He should review military matters. He should attend to religious duties. He should eat simply and carefully, because a king who ate too much or drank too much was a king whose judgment was compromised. The day was structured, systematic, disciplined. There was very little room in Chanakya's ideal kingdom for the kind of idle luxury that corrupted so many rulers. Power was not a reward to be enjoyed. It was a responsibility to be discharged. He wrote about ministers with a fascinating combination of trust and suspicion. Ministers were essential, because no king could know everything or be everywhere. But ministers were also inevitably self-interested, inevitably capable of betrayal or corruption or simple incompetence. Chanakya designed elaborate systems for monitoring ministers, for testing their loyalty, for checking the accounts of the treasury against independent audits, for ensuring that the men who ran the machinery of state were actually running it in the interests of the state and not in their own interests. He wrote about agriculture as the foundation of everything else. Without a healthy agricultural economy, there was no treasury. Without a treasury, there was no army. Without an army, there could be no security. And without security, there could be no prosperity. The chain of dependency was clear to him, and he traced it with careful logic from the fields where farmers worked in the monsoon rain, all the way to the throne room where the king received his foreign ambassadors. He wrote about trade and merchants with a pragmatism that would not be out of place in a modern economics textbook. He understood that merchants were necessary, that commerce generated wealth, and that a state which strangled commerce out of greed or ideology was a state that was impoverishing itself. But he also understood that merchants, left entirely unregulated, would find ways to exploit consumers and evade taxes and corner markets in ways that were ultimately destabilizing. The right relationship between the state and the merchant class was one of managed coexistence, mutual benefit constrained by clear rules and enforced by reliable inspection. He wrote about warfare with the eye of a man who had organized a campaign from scratch. He covered the composition of armies, the use of different troop types, cavalry and elephants and infantry and chariots, the organization of supply chains, the timing of campaigns in relation to the seasons and the availability of food and water. He wrote about siege warfare and about the defense of cities. He wrote about the treatment of conquered populations, urging a moderation and even generosity that he understood was not merely ethical, but strategically sound. A conquered people treated with respect were far more likely to become loyal subjects than a conquered people treated with contempt. He wrote about diplomacy with the sophistication of a man who had spent years thinking about the relationships between states. He articulated the theory of the mandala, the concept of circles of political relationships, the idea that your neighbor is your natural enemy because your interests conflict most directly with theirs, and your neighbor's neighbor is your natural ally because you share a common enemy. He mapped out the complex web of interests and enmities that characterized the relationship between states, and he tried to give rulers a systematic framework for navigating it. He wrote about intelligence, about spies, about the kinds of agents a state needed and how they should be recruited and managed. He was, in this domain, perhaps centuries ahead of his time. He understood that information was power, that the ability to know your enemy's intentions before they were acted upon was worth more than any number of additional soldiers, and he designed a system for gathering that information that was sophisticated and layered and built with redundancy so that it couldn't be easily compromised. And throughout all of this, running like a thread through the entire vast work, was a tension that Chanakya never entirely resolved. The tension between the necessities of power and the demands of ethics. He was not a naive man. He understood that governance sometimes required deception, that diplomacy sometimes required saying things you did not entirely mean, that maintaining the security of a state sometimes required actions that could not be judged by the simple standards of individual morality. He was willing to be ruthless when ruthlessness was necessary. He said so explicitly, but he also, and this is often forgotten in the easy characterization of Chanakya as a purely Machiavellian figure, cared about the people who lived within the empire he was building. He cared about justice. He cared about the welfare of farmers and workers and the poor and the vulnerable. He wrote about the duties of a king toward his subjects with a genuine moral seriousness that was not merely instrumental, not merely about stability and security, but about the actual quality of people's lives. The best king, in Chanakya's vision, was not the king who was most feared. It was the king who was most needed, the king whose subjects recognized that their lives were genuinely better under his rule than they would be under anyone else's. The Mauryan Empire, under Chandragupta's rule and Chanakya's guidance, reached its greatest extent. The administrative structures were functioning, the treasury was full, the borders were secure, the intelligence networks were operating. The empire that had been built from a boy playing in the dust and a scholar's oath of vengeance was, by any external measure, a remarkable success. Chanakya grew old in the service of this empire. His hair whitened and his body grew leaner with age, but by all accounts his mind remained what it had always been, precise, penetrating, incapable of rest. There came a point when Chandragupta, in a move that surprised many who observed it, decided to abdicate. He had been deeply influenced by the teachings of Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, whose philosophy of non-violence and renunciation had taken deep root in his later years. He gave the throne to his son Bindusara, and he himself became a Jain ascetic, eventually, according to tradition, taking the Jain practice of voluntary fasting unto death at the end of his life. The relationship between Chanakya and Chandragupta in these final years is recorded in stories that are likely more legend than history, but that ring true to the characters involved. There was, it is said, a genuine love between them, the love of a teacher for a student he had poured his life into, and of a student for the teacher who had seen him before anyone else did. and made him into something he could not have become alone. Chandragupta leaving was the departure of a king whom Chanakya had made. Bindusara was a different matter, a different personality, a different relationship. Chanakya continued to serve under Bindusara, though the relationship was more formal and more fraught. The dynamic between the counselor and the new king was never quite what it had been with Chandragupta. Bindusara inherited the empire, but had not been shaped by Chanakya in the same fundamental way his father had. There are stories of court intrigues in Bindusara's court, of enemies of Chanakya working to undermine him, of accusations and counter-accusations, of the kind of political maneuvering that Chanakya had spent his life orchestrating for others and now found directed against himself. One famous story, which may be legend but which has been told consistently across the tradition, describes how Chanakya, facing accusations of disloyalty that Bindusara had been persuaded to believe, chose to respond by withholding himself from court entirely and beginning a fast, the ancient Indian practice of a righteous man demonstrating his innocence and moral seriousness through voluntary suffering. The accusations were eventually shown to be false. The men who had made them were exposed as themselves corrupt. Chanakya was vindicated, but it was, perhaps, an indication that the world he had built was moving on, that the generation that had made the empire was giving way to the generation that had inherited it, and that the extraordinary alignment of talent and purpose that had produced the Mauryan state was not going to last forever. Chanakya, it is believed, died in the city of Pataliputra. He had lived there for most of his adult life, in simple quarters far removed from the grandeur of the palace he had helped build. He had overseen the construction of the greatest empire the subcontinent had ever known. He had written what would become one of the most influential works on governance and statecraft in the history of the world. He had educated a king and kept him alive through years of war and intrigue. The exact circumstances of his death are not clearly established by the historical record. He was old. He had been old, in the sense of carrying an enormous weight of experience and knowledge and difficult choices for a long time before his body finally followed. Some traditions say he died, still in service to the empire, still advising, still watching, still thinking. Others say he eventually withdrew, as the great ascetic scholars of his tradition ultimately did, into a kind of quietness that was not quite renunciation, but was a loosening of the grip on the world's affairs. What is certain is that he died as he had lived, with the clarity of a man who had thought carefully about death, as he had thought carefully about everything else. He had written in the Arthashastra that a king should accept death with the equanimity of a warrior and the peace of a philosopher. It is reasonable to assume that Chanakya, who had never asked anyone else to do anything he would not do himself, applied the same standard to his own dying. He was buried, or cremated, in the manner of his tradition, and the empire he had built continued without him, reaching its own extraordinary heights under Chandragupta's grandson Ashoka the Great, who would eventually extend the Mauryan Empire even further, and then, in one of the most remarkable transformations in political history, turn from the path of conquest to the path of dharma, renouncing further wars and dedicating his reign to the principles of compassion and non-violence. Chanakya did not live to see that transformation, but he had laid the foundations that made it possible. He had built the machine that Ashoka would eventually, partially and beautifully, dismantle in favor of something better. Close your eyes again. Think about that boy in the village, growing up with his father's books and his father's stories, learning to love ideas before he learned to love anything else. Think about the young man at Takshashila, sitting in the afternoon lessons about statecraft and governance, his mind running ahead of the teacher, his questions sharper than any sword in the campus armory. Think about the moment of humiliation in the Nanda court, the king's laughter, the shame of it, the burning, clarifying, terrifying moment when a man who has been laughed at decides, with absolute sincerity, that he is going to do something about it. Think about the years that followed, the wandering, the searching, the boy playing in the dust, the woman with the bowl of hot rice, the first failed campaign, the retreat, the rebuilding, the cold application of lessons learned from failure. Think about the decades in Pataliputra, the early mornings, the intelligence reports, the meetings with the king, the writing, leaf by leaf, of a book that would outlast every army and every throne and every empire that had ever existed in that part of the world. Think about the old man, finally, in his simple quarters, in the city he had built, in the empire he had made. Still thinking, still watching, still finding in the world an inexhaustible source of fascination and challenge. Chanakya was not a saint. He was not a god. He was not even, by the measure of his own philosophy, entirely good in the uncomplicated sense of the word. He did things that cost innocent people their lives. He built systems of power that, like all systems of power, served some people better than others. He was capable of coldness and calculation that could be terrifying, but he was also, in the deepest sense, a man who took the world seriously, who looked at the mess and complexity of human affairs, and refused to throw up his hands and retreat into either cynicism or idealism, who said instead that the world can be understood, that power can be analyzed, that governance can be improved, that the suffering of ordinary people can be reduced if the people who hold power think clearly and act with genuine intelligence and care. He spent his entire life trying to think clearly, and then he spent his entire life trying to act on what he thought. That is not nothing. In a world where most people manage either to think or to act, but rarely to do both at once, and rarer still to do both for as long as he did, and on the scale that he did, the life of Vishnugupta Kautilya Chanakya is not just a story about ancient India. It is a story about what a single human mind, properly trained and properly directed and properly willing to endure the difficulties of the path it has chosen, can actually accomplish in the time it has. The universe gave him one life, and he used it as completely as any human being we know of has ever used a life. That was his story. That is Chanakya. For many centuries after his death, Chanakya was almost forgotten. The Arthashastra, his great work of political philosophy, was not widely available. It existed in manuscripts that circulated among scholars but did not reach the broader world. His name was preserved in legend and in the dramatizations of later Sanskrit playwrights, but the full depth of his thinking was not accessible. And then, in the early 20th century, a scholar named Rudrapatna Shamasastri was working in the library of a Maharaja in Mysore when he came across a palm leaf manuscript. He recognized what it was. He spent years deciphering and translating it, and in 1915, he published the first modern translation of the Arthashastra. The world received it with something close to astonishment. Here was a text written 2,500 years ago that contained within it a systematic theory of governance, economics, military strategy, intelligence, and diplomacy that was not only historically remarkable, but genuinely useful. Political scholars and historians compared it to Machiavelli's The Prince and to the writings of Clausewitz on war, and found that in many respects, Chanakya had gone further than either of them, and had done so more than 15 centuries before Machiavelli was born. Today, Chanakya is studied in business schools and military academies and political science departments around the world. His ideas about intelligence and counterintelligence, about economic management, about the relationship between the security of the state and the welfare of the population, about the use of the 4 strategies of diplomacy, about the careful cultivation of information as a strategic resource. All of these ideas have found new audiences and new applications in every era since the Arthashastra was recovered. In India, he is a figure of enormous cultural resonance. There is something about his story that speaks to a deep and persistent truth about the relationship between power and intelligence, between the official face of authority and the mind that actually shapes events. He is the advisor behind the throne, the teacher who makes the king, the man whose name is not on the crown, but whose thinking is in every stone of the palace. He has been invoked by leaders of every political stripe and every ideological persuasion, which is perhaps a sign of how genuinely comprehensive his thinking was. You can find in Chanakya a justification for strong state intervention in the economy and a justification for market discipline. You can find a theory of welfare and a theory of security. You can find arguments for ruthlessness and arguments for mercy. He saw the whole picture and he drew it with a hand that did not tremble. No account of Chanakya would be honest if it told only the story of his genius and left aside the story of his ruthlessness. He was not a gentle man. He could not afford to be, perhaps, given the world he operated in. But the choices he made and the methods he employed came with costs that he himself acknowledged in his quieter moments. The intelligence networks that protected the empire also created a climate of surveillance and suspicion. The elaborate systems for testing the loyalty of ministers inevitably treated even faithful servants as potential traitors until proven otherwise. The willingness to use deception as a tool of statecraft meant that the court operated in an atmosphere where the complete truth was rarely spoken and rarely expected. There are accounts of Chanakya ordering the removal of individuals he considered dangerous, not through open accusation and trial, but through the quieter, darker methods available to a man who controlled an intelligence network. Some of these individuals, the historical record suggests, may not have been guilty of what they were suspected of. Chanakya's calculations were not infallible, and the cost of those miscalculations was sometimes paid in blood. He also carried, throughout his career, the weight of the original oath he had sworn in the Nanda court. The Nanda dynasty was destroyed, but destruction on that scale is never clean. People who were not themselves responsible for the humiliation of a poor scholar in a distant court died because of that humiliation, because of the consequences set in motion by a king's casual cruelty to a man he had decided to underestimate. Chanakya knew this. He was not the kind of man who managed the costs of his decisions by refusing to look at them. He looked at everything, he calculated everything, and he carried the knowledge of everything his actions had cost. There is in the later tradition a sense of Chanakya as a man who had chosen the path of power and statecraft over the path of pure renunciation, who had put his learning in service of the world rather than withdrawing from it into the forests, as many ascetic scholars of his era did, and who understood that this choice came with a particular kind of spiritual cost. The man who acts in the world, who makes decisions that affect the lives of millions, who uses power even in service of good ends, is not the same as the man who withdraws from the world and seeks purity. He knew he was not pure. He had chosen to be effective instead. The scope of the Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta, built on the foundations that Chanakya had laid, eventually extended across an enormous portion of the subcontinent. It was the largest empire the region had ever seen, reaching from the northwest frontier, where the successor states of Alexander's empire began, across the great Gangetic plain and south into the Deccan, and it attracted the attention of the world. A Greek ambassador named Megasthenes was sent to Pataliputra by Seleucus Nicator, one of Alexander's former generals who had taken control of the eastern portion of Alexander's empire, following a diplomatic settlement in which he ceded the northwestern territories of the subcontinent to Chandragupta in exchange for 500 war elephants. Megasthenes stayed in Pataliputra for several years. He wrote a detailed account of what he saw, a work called the Indica, most of which is now lost, but fragments of which were preserved in the writings of later Greek and Roman authors, and what he described was a court and a kingdom of extraordinary sophistication. He wrote about the scale and organization of the city of Pataliputra. He described the administrative structures, the system of committees that oversaw different functions of city governance. He noted the extensive use of a sophisticated system of weights and measures that ensured fairness in trade. He wrote about the army, which was enormous and well-equipped and organized with a professionalism that clearly impressed him. And he wrote about the atmosphere of the court itself, the way the king was surrounded by a complex protective apparatus, the way information flowed to the center of power, the way decisions were made and implemented with a speed and coherence that suggested a very unusual level of central organization. He was observing, without fully understanding its source, the architecture that Chanakya had built, the intelligence networks, the administrative structures, the systems of accountability, the carefully designed flow of information to the top. The settlement with Seleucus was itself a triumph of Chanakyan diplomacy. Seleucus had initially attempted to reconquer the northwestern territories that Alexander had previously held. The military encounter that followed did not go well for him. Chandragupta's armies, trained and organized on the principles that Chanakya had outlined in the Arthashastra, proved too formidable. Seleucus recognized that conquest was not viable and negotiated instead. The 500 war elephants that Chandragupta provided as part of the settlement subsequently played a significant role in Seleucus's own military campaigns in the west. They were part of the decisive force at the Battle of Ipsus, one of the great set-piece battles of the successor era, where they helped determine the outcome of a conflict that had nothing directly to do with India, but whose ramifications shaped the Hellenistic world for generations. Indian elephants, Indian power, projected, indirectly but unmistakably, into the power politics of the Mediterranean world, through the strategic thinking of a man who had grown up in poverty and had been laughed out of a king's court. Let us step back now from the grand sweep of history and try to imagine the daily life of the man himself. Because Chanakya was not just a thinker and a schemer, he was a human being who ate meals and slept in a bed and experienced the passing of ordinary days. He lived, by all accounts, with extreme simplicity. He had taken no permanent wife, or if he had, she and any family he might have formed are absent from the historical record in a way that suggests that domestic life was not the center of his world. He lived in small quarters, simply furnished. He ate the food of an ascetic scholar, plain and functional, not because he could not have had better, but because he believed that a man who required luxury was a man who could be controlled by the threat of its removal. He rose before dawn every day. This was not just the principle he outlined in the Arthashastra, it was his personal practice. The early hours of the morning were, for Chanakya, the most important hours. The mind was clearest then, before the business and noise of the day began. He would meditate and pray in the manner of a Brahmin scholar, reciting the Vedic verses he had known since childhood, grounding himself in the deeper tradition from which all his thinking flowed. Then he would receive the reports of his intelligence network. This was a daily practice. He had agents throughout the empire and beyond its borders, and the information they gathered flowed to him through a system of couriers and coded messages that he had designed personally. He read these reports with complete attention, committing the important details to memory, noting the anomalies, the things that didn't fit, the small discrepancies that might indicate something larger developing below the surface. He was famous, among those who knew him well, for his capacity to see patterns that others missed. To take a dozen small, apparently unrelated pieces of information and assemble them into a picture that no single piece would have suggested. It was this ability, more than any other single quality, that made him irreplaceable. His working days were spent largely in council with Chandragupta. They met regularly, often for hours at a time, working through the decisions of governance with an intimacy and intensity that was quite different from the formal court ceremonials that occupied much of a king's public time. In these private meetings, Chanakya was not deferential. He argued, challenged, pushed back, insisted. He had not built an empire through flattery, and he was not going to govern one that way either. Chandragupta, to his credit, had learned to receive this from his teacher. He had been taught since boyhood that the greatest service a counselor could render was not to tell the king what he wanted to hear, but to tell him what he needed to know. He trusted Chanakya as he trusted no one else, and that trust was, as far as the historical record shows, not misplaced. There is a remarkable account of an exchange between them that captures the dynamic perfectly. It is said that Chanakya once discovered that the food being prepared for the king had been tampered with, poisoned in a way that would have killed Chandragupta slowly and left no obvious trace. He had discovered this not through any dramatic intervention, but simply through the careful attention of his intelligence network, which monitored everything that entered the royal household. He brought the information to the king. He did not bring it wrapped in alarm or drama. He brought it the way he brought all information, directly, clearly, with an immediate recommendation for what to do about it. The king, they say, asked Chanakya how he had come to know about this before it could happen. Chanakya replied, with the calm of a man who had been thinking about these problems for decades, that a king who trusted his life to the loyalty of servants without verification was a king who would not live long enough to be a good king. Safety, like everything else in the management of a state, required systematic effort. It could not be assumed. He also worked alone, for many hours each day, writing. The Arthashastra was not composed in a single sitting, or even a single year. It was built over decades, revised and expanded and refined as his thinking deepened and as the practical experience of actually governing an empire tested and sometimes challenged the theories he had developed at Takshashila. He wrote on palm leaves in the careful script of a Brahmin scholar, and when he had filled one leaf he would put it aside and begin another, building the great edifice of his political philosophy one carefully considered line at a time. He taught too. He had students, young men of promise who came to him for instruction in statecraft and governance. He was not always an easy teacher. He demanded rigor, and he did not accept lazy thinking or comfortable assumptions. But those who endured his teaching emerged with a clarity of thought about power and governance that was available nowhere else, and he thought about the world beyond the empire's borders. He kept careful watch on the successor states that had emerged from Alexander's empire in the northwest, assessing their stability and their intentions. He tracked the development of other kingdoms on the subcontinent, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses, and assessing how they might eventually interact with the growing Mauryan Empire. He thought in decades and in geography on a scale that was unusual for his time. Taking a kingdom and governing a kingdom are two entirely different problems. History is full of brilliant conquerors who were mediocre rulers, men who could take power but could not hold it, who understood war but not peace, who could burn a city but not build one. Chanakya was determined that Chandragupta would not be such a king, and he was equally determined that the empire now taking shape around the city of Pataliputra would be built on the systematic principles he had been developing since his student days at Takshashila. He moved into the heart of the new administration with the same intelligence and relentless energy he had brought to the campaign. He became prime minister, the chief counselor to the new Maurya king, and in this role he was, for all practical purposes, the architect of everything that followed. The state that Chanakya built was extraordinary by the standards of any era. He organized a civil service of remarkable sophistication, different departments with defined responsibilities, ministers overseeing finance, agriculture, trade, justice, military affairs, each with clear mandates and accountability structures. He believed deeply in the idea that good governance was not a matter of individual virtue, but of institutional design. You could not simply hope that the right people would always be in the right positions. You had to build systems that constrained even bad people and incentivized even mediocre people to perform their functions. He created a network of state-run industries. Agriculture was managed with careful attention to irrigation and crop rotation and the prevention of famine. Mining was organized and regulated. Forests were managed as strategic resources. Trade routes were protected and tolls collected on them in ways that generated revenue without strangling commerce. He set up what amounted to a welfare system for the most vulnerable in the empire's population: widows, orphans, the elderly, the disabled, those who through no fault of their own found themselves unable to provide for themselves. Not out of pure sentiment, though there was sentiment in it, but out of the practical understanding that a state where the weakest were entirely abandoned was a state that bred the resentment and desperation that eventually turned into rebellion. His intelligence network, already formidable, was expanded and systematized. He had agents in every city and town and village of consequence, watching and listening and reporting. He had agents in foreign courts, in the retinues of rival kings, in the trading caravans that moved goods across the subcontinent. He ran, by any modern description, a sophisticated state security apparatus, and he wrote. This is perhaps the greatest of all his legacies, greater even than the empire he helped build. because empires eventually fall, as he knew they would. But ideas, if they are good enough, can survive the empires that gave birth to them. The Arthashastra, the book of statecraft, while Chanakya was educating Chandragupta, the political world around them was shifting in ways that a man of Chanakya's intelligence could not fail to notice. In the northwest of the subcontinent, in the regions beyond Takshashila, a force of unprecedented scale and ambition was pressing toward India. Alexander the Great, king of Macedon, general of armies that had already swept from Greece across Persia and into Central Asia, had crossed the Hindu Kush and was advancing through what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. His armies were extraordinary by any measure, disciplined, experienced, and inspired by a commander of singular genius. Some accounts suggest that Chanakya and Chandragupta actually encountered Alexander's army, or at least envoys from it, during this period. There are stories that Chandragupta was bold enough to approach the Macedonian camp, and that the encounter did not go well, that he was too direct, too blunt, too much like his teacher in his disregard for the diplomatic rituals that powerful men expected. He reportedly had to flee the Macedonian camp to avoid arrest. But Chanakya, watching the Macedonian advance, drew from it a strategic lesson of enormous importance. The Greek armies had been devastating the kingdoms of the northwest. They were far better organized, far more disciplined, and far more innovative in their tactics than the forces they were encountering. But they had been meeting the kingdoms of the northwest one at a time, isolated and fragmented, unable to combine into a force that could match the Macedonian machine. This fragmentation, Chanakya understood, was the great vulnerability of the Indian subcontinent. There was no unified empire. There were dozens of kingdoms, each jealously guarding its own independence, each too proud and too short-sighted to see that alone they were all prey, and together they could be something else entirely. Alexander, as it happened, turned back at the Bias River. His soldiers, exhausted and homesick after years of campaign in lands increasingly far from home, refused to march further east. He turned south, campaigned along the Indus, and eventually left the subcontinent entirely, dying in Babylon in 323 before the Common Era, before he could consolidate his Indian gains. But the lesson remained. The northwest, the regions that Alexander had swept through, were now in a state of post-Macedonian disorder, the Greek garrison states he had left behind struggling to maintain control. This was an opportunity, and in the east, the Nanda dynasty of Magadha, while still the most powerful single force in northern India, was showing signs of internal weakness. Dhanananda had become increasingly unpopular. His taxation was heavy, his military demands on the population were growing, and the resentment that had been building for years was beginning to crack the loyalty of his subjects. Chanakya saw all of this with the eye of a master strategist. He saw the pieces on the board, and he began to move them. He started building Chandragupta's military force from the tribal peoples of the forests and hills, from the regions that the Nanda armies had never fully controlled, from among the warriors of smaller kingdoms who had reason to resent Nanda power. He used his knowledge of economics to fund the operation, knowing which merchants would support a challenger to the Nanda throne if they believed the challenger would win, knowing which local rulers could be persuaded through the promise of favorable terms after victory. He deployed his intelligence networks ruthlessly. He had agents in Pataliputra itself, inside the Nanda court, feeding him information about the king's state of mind, about the loyalties of his ministers, about the disposition of his armies. He sent agents into enemy territories to spread rumors and sow dissent, to encourage defections, to make Dhanananda's advisors mistrust each other, and he made sure that every move Chandragupta made was calculated to build his reputation among the people who would eventually need to choose between the two kings, because Chanakya understood something that many military thinkers of his era did not. The most important battle was not fought on a physical battlefield. The most important battle was fought in the minds of the population. A king who was feared was fragile. A king who was respected was strong. and a king who was seen as the legitimate, just, and inevitable successor to a corrupt and despised dynasty was almost unassailable. So while the armies were being built and the strategies were being plotted, Chanakya also worked at the level of narrative and legitimacy. He cultivated the idea of Chandragupta as the right king for the time, not a rebel or a bandit, but a restorer of proper order, the man who would end the tyranny of the Nandas and bring peace and justice to Magadha. The Nanda dynasty ruled the kingdom of Magadha, one of the most powerful kingdoms in northern India at the time. The capital was Pataliputra, a great city on the banks of the Ganges, rich and populated, and strategically vital. The Nanda kings were not Brahmins. They were of lower caste origin, which in the deeply hierarchical society of that era was a source of both resentment and ambition. They had risen to power through cunning and force, and they maintained power through a combination of military strength and a treasury so large it was said to be the wonder of the known world. The reigning king at this time was Dhanananda, the last of the Nanda line. By most accounts, Dhanananda was not a terrible king in the simple sense of the word. He was competent enough. He kept the kingdom together. His armies were formidable, but he was also arrogant, dismissive, and surrounded himself with yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. And he had a particular contempt for Brahmins, for scholars, for men who dealt in ideas rather than armies. He was, in the language of our own time, the kind of powerful man who mistakes the trappings of power for power itself, who cannot see past the robes and the swords to the actual forces that hold a kingdom together. Chanakya came to the Nanda court at Pataliputra. He had by this point completed his studies at Takshashila, or at least reached the stage where he had learned what the university could teach him and was ready to move into the world. He was a recognized scholar of formidable reputation. He had been thinking deeply about governance for years, and he came to Pataliputra with a purpose. He wanted to offer his knowledge in service of something larger than himself. He wanted to contribute to the project of making a kingdom strong and just, and Magadha, as the most powerful kingdom in the region, seemed like the right place to do that. What happened next is one of the most dramatically retold moments in the entire history of the Indian subcontinent. Chanakya entered the court of Dhanananda. He was not dressed in the robes of a rich man. He was a scholar, simply dressed, angular and severe-looking, his manner direct to the point of what the courtiers around him would have considered rudeness. He spoke plainly. He did not flatter. He presented himself as what he was, a man of extraordinary intellect who had ideas that could benefit the kingdom. The king looked at him and laughed. Some accounts say the king insulted him directly, calling him ugly, calling him presumptuous, a low-born scholar who had wandered into a king's hall thinking his learning entitled him to a seat at the table of power. Some accounts say Chanakya was physically removed from the court, thrown out, humiliated before the assembled courtiers and dignitaries who watched with the cruel amusement of people who enjoy watching someone powerful remind someone powerless of their place. The exact words vary depending on which text you read and which tradition you follow, but the core of it is consistent across all the stories. Dhanananda humiliated Chanakya, dismissed him, treated him not as a scholar but as a joke, sent him away, and in that moment, something happened inside Chanakya that would ultimately bring down the entire Nanda dynasty. He swore an oath. In some accounts, he did it right there in the court, before the king and all his men. In others, he did it privately, standing outside the palace, alone in his anger and his humiliation. But the oath itself is consistent. Chanakya swore that he would destroy the Nanda dynasty, not just drive it from power, destroy it, root it out, replace it with something better, something built on genuine principle rather than arrogance and inherited contempt. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary thing for a poor scholar with no army, no treasury, and no political connections to swear. The courtiers who heard it, if they heard it at all, probably laughed again. Who was this man? What could he possibly do? They were about to find out. If you want to understand who Chanakya became, You must first understand where he was educated. Because Takshashila was not just a school, it was not just a place where young men went to learn mathematics and grammar and sit politely in rows while a teacher recited verses. Takshashila was the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Imagine the greatest university you have ever heard of, and then make it bigger, older, and stranger. Takshashila sat at the crossroads of trade routes, the junction where the cultures of Persia and Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent met and mixed and argued and traded, not just goods but ideas. Scholars came there from across the known world. Students arrived from every corner of the subcontinent and beyond, young men of extraordinary ability and ambition, drawn by the reputation of the teachers who had built their lives and reputations in those halls and gardens. At Takshashila, you could study the Vedas and the Upanishads, the oldest and deepest texts of Hindu philosophy. You could study medicine in a tradition that would eventually give the world Ayurveda, the science of life. You could study military strategy and statecraft. You could study astronomy and mathematics. You could study the philosophy of logic, the art of rhetoric, the science of governance. You could study archery and swordsmanship alongside Sanskrit grammar. The disciplines were not separated as we separate them today into neat boxes called science and humanities and arts. They were understood as one great interconnected body of knowledge, and the best students were expected to master as much of it as they could. When Chanakya arrived at Takshashila, he arrived poor and unknown. He had no family connections to smooth his way, no wealthy patron to introduce him to the right teachers, no family name that would open doors. What he had was his mind, and that was enough. Within a very short time, the teachers at Takshashila noticed something unusual about this thin, intense young man from Taxila. He did not simply learn what was taught. He questioned it. He challenged it. He arrived at a lesson with a dozen questions already prepared, and by the end of the lesson he had a dozen more. He was difficult in the way that genuinely exceptional students are difficult. He made his teachers work. He made them think, and several of them, the best of them, the ones secure enough in their own knowledge to welcome a challenge, recognized him for what he was, a mind like a blade, sharp, precise, and capable of cutting through almost anything if properly directed. Chanakya studied at Takshashila for many years. The curriculum was deep and broad. In the mornings, students would rise before dawn and begin their day with meditation and the recitation of Vedic verses, the ancient Sanskrit flowing through the cool air before the sun had fully risen. Then would come the first lessons of the day, often in philosophy or sacred text interpretation. The teacher seated on a mat while students sat before him in a semicircle, each one expected to participate, to question, to engage. After the morning lessons, students ate simple vegetarian meals, the kind of food that scholars and ascetics ate, rice and lentils and vegetables, nothing that would cloud the mind or excite the passions. Then came the afternoon lessons, which tended toward more practical disciplines, military strategy, the administration of states and kingdoms, economics, the study of what we might today call political science, the science of how power is organized, how it is maintained, how it is lost. It was in these afternoon lessons that Chanakya truly came alive. He had grown up hearing his father's stories about kings who fell because they made mistakes in governance. He had grown up in poverty and understood at a bone-deep level that good governance was not an abstract philosophical game. It was life and death. It was the difference between a kingdom where farmers could grow enough to eat and a kingdom where armies burned the harvests. It was the difference between a treasury that could build roads and schools and a treasury that was looted by the greedy few. Chanakya began to develop, in those years at Takshashila, what would become the great project of his intellectual life. He began to think seriously and systematically about the question of how a state should be governed, not how it was governed, not how kings imagined they governed, but how it should be, if the goal was genuine stability, genuine prosperity, genuine security for the millions of ordinary people who lived within its borders. He read everything available on the subject. He studied the ancient texts of governance. He studied the accounts of foreign empires and their methods. He argued with fellow students late into the night. He sat at the feet of the greatest teachers Takshashila could offer, extracting every idea he could and testing it against his own emerging framework. And slowly, over those years, the framework took shape. It would eventually become the Arthashastra, but that came later. First, Chanakya had to encounter the event that would change the direction of his entire life. The event that would transform a brilliant scholar into something far more dangerous and far more consequential. He had to meet the Nanda king. It is a story about ancient India, yes, but it is also a story about every era, because the lessons Chanakya left behind have never stopped being true. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely like what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now sit back and relax, because this story begins over 2,000 years ago, in a small village, with a very unusual child, and a very patient father who told his son that ideas were the most dangerous weapons in the world. He was right. This is the life of Chanakya.